TT Isle of Man Ride on the Edge 3 is, as the title suggests, the third entry in the Ride on the Edge series, although other than the name it shares very little with its predecessors. Made by Race Wars Studios, it feels much more like their 2021 entry Rims Racing than any of the previous entries in the TT franchise. In this review I'll be covering different areas of the game that will be time-stamped in the description below so you can jump to the parts that interest you. So, is it third time's the charm as they say? Let's find out. It wouldn't be a game review without mentioning the graphics, and as always the KT engine delivers and the game looks great. Whether you're racing down Bray Hill with Peter Hickman's BMW or going through the veranda on Dean Harrison's Kawasaki, the game does a fantastic job at giving that Isle of Man appearance. Around the course you'll see lots of highly detailed foliage and buildings, although it's hard to look at them when you're racing past at over 100 miles an hour. You'll also come across some of the fans cheering you on through the town sections, and that's not even mentioning the bikes that are aesthetically pleasing in their own right. The rider animations are excellent, with the ability for one or both legs to come off the foot pegs in a realistic looking manner. Along with this, the ragdoll animations actually look like a fallen rider rather than a human shaped blob rolling across the ground. So I've established that the game looks good, but not everything's so positive. You'll experience frame drops in the more woodland areas, which seems to be present regardless of the hardware or platform, so on console and PC it does appear to be an issue, although if you're using a pretty powerful PC it may be actually less of an issue. Along with that, the game also suffers from quite a lot of pop-in, where you'll see objects appear or change to higher detailed versions of themselves very suddenly when you're quite close. This isn't even mentioning the graphical bugs like all the riders having shiny black necks or the Dunlops that look suspiciously like Pirellis. The physics can make or break a racing game, especially motorcycle games, but I'm pleased to say that Isle of Man 3 is a massive step forward on the physics side. Gone are the weird back-end slides that resulted in the bike spinning around like a car, along with the ridiculously fast lap times seen in the other entries. It's clear that the game's physics are based on the aforementioned Rims Racing, so if you've played that game, it will feel somewhat familiar. But don't get it twisted, this isn't simply a Rims clone, enough is changed to make it behave a bit differently. There are 3 different physics modes: beginner, intermediate and realistic. Now all the testing I've done has been on the realistic setting, so all my thoughts will be based on this. In addition to these modes there is also multiple assists, semi-automatic gears, joint brakes and automatic tuck-in. Then when you're actually on the track you can adjust different electronical aids such as traction control, anti-wheelie, engine braking and anti-lock brakes. So whether you're a beginner or a veteran you should be able to find a combination that works perfectly for you. Overall I'd say the bike feels quite fluid and much less stiff than in the previous entries. The brakes are fairly powerful, but they do take a bit of time to adjust to, as they can be applied a little bit more aggressively than what I've experienced in other recent bike games. However, I do have some complaints, a few of which I also had with rims. So there's actually very little feedback from the bike. I oftentimes found myself losing the front very unexpectedly, especially through some of the slower hairpin corners around the course. I feel that these crashes could have been prevented if I had some sort of feeling from the front end of the bike beforehand. Probably would have been able to pick the bike up or just adjust my trajectory to stop that crash from happening. There also seems to be an inherent understeer with the bike, which I've definitely underestimated at times and found myself hitting into a curb and going down. The direction changes feel rather sluggish too, a seemingly all too common feature of current day bike games. Another issue I have is with the suspension. It seems to react and snap back very aggressively and suddenly, especially going through many dips on the mountain course, so expect yourself to have a random crash or two from this. But by far, my biggest disappointment from the physics is the absence of a slipstream effect. You can be as close as you like, the optimal slipstreaming distance from the bike ahead, and nothing. You don't gain anything at all. This is a rather large oversight from the developers, as we see huge slipstream effects in some of the flat out sections in the real life TT, and when you're in a time trial trying to pass a slower rider ahead, every second counts. An unfortunately common theme in race war titles seems to be the lack of content, especially when you compare TT3 to its predecessor TT2. In that game there were many bikes to choose from: Supersport, Superbike, Sidecars, Classics, but in TT3 you only get last year's Superbikes and Supersport rosters. I do believe there is a DLC for the 2023 bikes and riders on the way, but even with that, there's much less than there was in the previous game. It's a similar story with the circuits, but I'm not going to complain too much about a TT game not having many other tracks, as after all that's where you buy the TT game, for the TT Mountain Course. But the fantasy Irish road racing courses are now gone, replaced with some other courses all around the Isle of Man where the game is completely based this time. Of course it goes without saying we've got the current mountain course, but along with that we've also got the classic St John's and Clips courses, and then alongside that we've got some other ones: Laxey, South East, South West, North East and North West courses. There's also actually an entire free roam section of the game where you can ride around the whole island to your heart's content, so from the circuit side there's still plenty of options, even though there are some missing from the previous entry. The career mode is an interesting one. The developers made some very odd decisions during the design process. For one, you can no longer play as your custom rider, but instead you must choose an official rider from either Supersport or Superbike. Now it's worth noting that you can actually do these concurrently, so you can have one career in Superbike and one career in Supersport as separate save files, but you can't however do two Supersport or two Superbike saves at the same time. It must be one and the other, you can't do two of the same. The overall structure of the career mode works like this. You have 8 qualifying events and 8 race events in order to unlock the TT, in which then you have to do the qualifying and the race, of course, with the TT. Along the way, you can also participate in some optional challenge events, such as head-to-head races against another rider. All of these events can either be ridden to in the free roam or selected on the map and fast travel to in a very Forza Horizon-esque way. This is where it starts to get odd though. When you complete a qualifying event, the corresponding race event is unlocked. But strangely, you'll qualify at one circuit and then go and race at a completely different one all the way across the island, starting in the position that you just qualified in the previous event. Quite why they decided to do this, I'm not really sure. As for the qualifying events, you actually get a free practice session, so you get half an hour free practice, then half an hour to set your time, so you get plenty of time to learn the track. But for the race, you just put on the grid straight away, lights are out, off you go, so you have to learn on the fly. After you've completed an event, you earn upgrade points that can be used to upgrade different parts of the bike to improve the performance. This works in tandem with the regular setup menu that you can use to alter the bike setup. For a time trial game, the AI might not seem super important as you don't expect to see them when catching a 10-second interval up or being caught yourself, but there is actually the ability in the game to do a mass start, a more traditional type of race where you start on the grid and race for position rather than time. These races feature quite heavily in the career mode, so you'll certainly be going bar to bar with the AI more often than you think. In terms of their overall speed, they do seem quite fast, although I'll be the first to admit I'm not the best at road racing games, so some of you faster players may disagree with me on that. They are very one-line and train track-like though, rarely if ever overtaking each other, and they don't particularly seem to have much awareness for the player either. I did also encounter a strange bug on the southeast course where going through one of the corners the AI would just slow down and weave from one side of the track to the other over and over in a zigzag pattern before returning to normal after exiting the corner. This made for an easy win as they easily lost 20 seconds from this. My online playtime has been limited, but nonetheless I have done a few races. In all honesty, it doesn't seem super stable. Even with as few as 2 riders, there were strange lag spikes where the other bikes would sort of jump from one side of the track to the other. Now these weren't constant, but it did happen enough for me to take notice. The bikes also seem to jitter around quite a bit as well, which is pretty unnerving when trying to pull a pass at the most dangerous track of them all. We also had one player whose game would crash whenever we were loading back to the lobby, which is less than ideal for everyone. In the online mode, you can play all the modes you'd expect, all the tracks and both race types are playable, and even qualifying is present. However, qualifying does end immediately when the clock hits 0, rather than allowing you to finish your lap, so if you're on a lap, it just doesn't count, and it just ends the session. I won't spend too much time on this section because I don't have too much to say about it, but in this game you can race in either dry or wet conditions. Now like me, you'd probably expect there to be less grip in the rain with the bike sliding around quite a lot underneath you, but in fact the bike feels better in the rain than in the dry. The grip levels are seemingly identical, but pretty much every bump is smoothened in the rain, which makes these conditions both faster and easier to ride in. I'm not really sure how they've managed to achieve this, but it certainly took me by surprise. I was thinking going into the wet conditions, it'd be extremely difficult to keep on the circuit, but it was the easiest race I've ever done. I've put this section to talk about some of the other thoughts that I've had that don't really fit into the prior categories. First of all, I do want to talk a little bit about the menus. The game flow is really weird, it seems laid out very strangely. When you launch the game you are put straight into the open world riding around, then you must pause to get to what is effectively the main menu. On this menu you can go online, start a custom event, go to the settings, view the map, etc. Pretty much all the things you'd expect to see on a main menu. So if you just wanted to play a quick race or to go online, you must load into the free roam, then pause, then go into those modes. Now it's not really the end of the world, especially if you're on a PC with an SSD, but if you're on an old PS4 or Xbox One with an old hard drive, you'll be definitely waiting a while to do absolutely anything in this game. I just don't get why they don't just load you into a main menu first, and then you can select the free roam, which is effectively part of the career as well on top of that. It just makes no sense, you have to then actually go into the free mode first, then go to the menu, when for me it definitely should be the other way around. Another thing I did want to talk about is the bugs. I've encountered quite a few whilst playing, the biggest of which is the inability to shift gears in races. It seems to work fine in the free roam, but you can't shift up off the line in the races at all, which forces you to use semi-automatic gears to even play the game because you're just stuck on the line otherwise. I have been told that developers are fixing this apparently, but even still, it shouldn't have occurred in the first place, and because I'm doing the review whilst it's still in the game, I'm going to mention it. Overall, I'd say it's a pretty solid game, lacking in some areas definitely, especially in the content and the physics. Physics still seem a little bit arcadey, a big step from the previous entries of course, but they really weren't a very high bar to pass. But if you are a fan of the Isle of Man TT, then this is definitely the best way to experience it so far compared to any of the other entries. So if you're still playing one of the previous games, I definitely recommend upgrading, as it'll be much more enjoyable from a gameplay standpoint. But if you're looking just for a new bike game to play and don't have a particular love or fondness for the TT, I'd say maybe wait for now, maybe wait for a sale or to see if there's any extra updates coming. Obviously it's a new release that's fairly expensive, so if you're not really 100% set on the TT, it's perhaps not the best bike game you could buy for your money. I hope this review has helped any of you that were on the fence about buying the game, and of course if you have any questions, do ask me in the comments below. And if you are new to my channel, please do like the video and subscribe to see more bike game videos. But for now, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.